Never expected a simple moment to turn into something so awkward, so unforgettable. It was just another ordinary afternoon, the kind where you move through the day without thinking too much about the little things. I had just stepped out of the shower, wrapped in a towel, my mind lost in the usual routine of getting dressed. The house was quiet, or at least I thought it was. I wasn't expecting anyone to be around. But then, out of nowhere, the door swung open. For a split second, time froze. My stepson stood there, his eyes wide with surprise, his hand still on the doorknob. Neither of us spoke. It was one of those moments where you want to react instantly, but your brain is too busy trying to process what just happened. My heart pounded in my chest. I could see the shock on his face, mirroring my own. I scrambled to grab whatever was nearby, my hands fumbling with the edge of my towel as I turned away, heat rushing to my face. "Oh my God!" The words slipped out before I could stop them. He stammered something, an apology, I think, but his feet seemed stuck to the floor. It was like neither of us knew what to do. The air between us grew thick with unspoken words, a tension that neither of us meant to create, but was suddenly impossible to ignore. And just like that, he bolted. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving me standing there, breathless, my mind racing. I let out a shaky sigh, trying to steady myself. It was an accident, just an innocent mistake. But then why did it feel so strange? Why did my stomach twist with something I couldn't quite name? As the day went on, I tried to shake off the moment, convincing myself it was nothing, just one of those awkward things that happen in life. But when I saw him later that evening, sitting across from me at the dinner table, his eyes flickered up for only a second before looking away. I could tell he was thinking about it too. That moment, that split second of crossing a line neither of us meant to approach. The silence between us wasn't the same as before. It carried something unspoken, something we both felt but didn't have the words for. And that's when I realized some moments, no matter how unplanned, have a way of changing everything. I tried to carry on as if everything was fine, but the truth was, things had shifted. I wasn't the only one who felt it. There was an odd energy between us now, like something hung in the air that neither of us could ignore. It wasn't just awkward anymore. It was loaded with something else, something unspoken. I couldn't stop thinking about that look in his eyes, the way his face seemed frozen for a second, as if he was trying to process what he had just seen, what had just happened. Later that night, we all sat down for dinner, the clink of silverware and the low hum of conversation trying to fill the space. But I couldn't help but feel like the whole room was aware of the invisible barrier between us. My wife, his mom, didn't seem to notice anything unusual, blissfully chatting about her day. But I could feel it. Every time I looked across the table at him, I caught that fleeting, nervous glance before he quickly turned his eyes back down to his plate. I was sure he was thinking about the same thing. I tried to tell myself it was just a moment of embarrassment, a fluke, really. But something in me was stirring, and I couldn't quiet the questions that kept racing through my mind. What if this changed everything? What if it didn't? I was torn between wanting to forget it and wanting to understand why it felt so different now. After dinner, I went to the living room, hoping to relax and distract myself. I put on a movie, but I couldn't concentrate. Every few minutes, my mind kept drifting back to that moment, that accidental crossing of boundaries. It wasn't that I was angry or upset, just confused. Was this something I had to worry about? Did he? That's when I heard the knock on the door. It was soft at first, like he was unsure of whether or not to disturb me. I hesitated, my heart picking up speed. I didn't want to make things more uncomfortable than they already were, but I knew we couldn't just pretend it didn't happen. I opened the door. There he stood, looking even younger than his age, his posture stiff, as if he was holding himself back from saying something. His face was a mixture of guilt and curiosity. Without a word, he handed me a small folded piece of paper. He didn't wait for me to open it, didn't even speak a word. He just turned and walked away. I stood there, holding the paper, wondering if I should follow him or just let things be. My hands were shaking as I unfolded it, and what I saw made my stomach drop. It was just a few words, but they were enough to make me question everything. What did he mean by this? I stared at the note in my hands, my mind racing. The words were simple, but they hit me like a punch in the gut. We need to talk. The letter was brief, but it carried a weight that made it impossible to ignore. Who was this for? Was it for me or for him? I had no idea, but I knew it wasn't something I could brush off. I didn't know what he wanted to say, and that was the worst part. It wasn't just the awkwardness from that day that had changed everything. It was the uncertainty. It felt like something else had shifted beneath the surface, and I was starting to wonder if it wasn't just about the accident anymore. Was there more to this? Was he trying to communicate something deeper? Later that night, I found myself waiting by the door, trying to figure out the best way to approach him. But my mind was a mess of questions and confusion. What if I made things worse? What if talking about it just made everything more uncomfortable? On the other hand, if I ignored it, the tension would just keep building, and I wasn't sure how long I could pretend everything was fine. The door creaked open again, and he stepped inside, this time without hesitation. He was more composed, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet intensity that I hadn't noticed before. We both stood there for a moment, neither of us knowing how to start. My mouth was dry, but I finally managed to speak. "What did you want to say?" He hesitated, his lips pressed together. It's, it's not what you think. He finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just need to explain something." I swallowed hard. This was the moment I had been dreading, the moment everything could either unravel or find some kind of resolution. But I had no idea which way it was going to go. His words hung in the air, heavy with an uncertainty that only made the situation feel more surreal. I wanted to say something, to push him to explain further, but the tension between us felt like it was closing in. I could feel my pulse quicken as I waited for him to speak again, my breath shallow. It was as if we were both on the edge of something, and I had no idea how it was going to unfold. He shifted his weight, nervously glancing around the room as if trying to find the right words. "It's hard to explain," he murmured, his eyes flickering to mine for a split second before he looked away. "But I need you to understand that it wasn't just an accident. What happened earlier, it was more than that." My chest tightened, and I felt the room grow smaller. What did he mean by that? Was he trying to say something that went beyond a simple mistake? The possibility that this moment was more than just an embarrassing situation hit me like a cold wave. The uncertainty between us suddenly felt so much more intense. I opened my mouth, but the words caught in my throat. What if he was trying to say something I wasn't ready to hear? What if I was completely wrong about everything? He looked like he wanted to say more, but he hesitated, as if trying to decide whether it was worth continuing. The silence between us stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. The clock ticked louder in the background, each second dragging us closer to an uncomfortable truth neither of us was sure we were ready to face. I could see him wrestling with something, whether it was his own feelings or his thoughts on what had just happened. And the longer we stood there, the more I realized that we were both trapped in this unspoken tension, unable to break free. Finally, he took a deep breath. "I just need you to know, I didn't mean for any of this to happen." But the way he said it didn't feel like an apology. It felt like something else, something unspoken. His words lingered in the air, but I wasn't sure what to make of them. The tension between us was almost suffocating, and I couldn't decide whether to push him for more or let him speak at his own pace. He was still standing there, avoiding my gaze, as though he was trying to put together a thought that kept slipping away. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he repeated, but there was something about his voice that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the apology I had expected. It wasn't the relief I'd hoped for. Instead, it felt like he was saying those words because he thought they were what I needed to hear, not because he truly understood what had transpired. And suddenly, the room felt even smaller. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the sound of a door opening behind us broke the silence. We both froze, startled, and I turned to see my wife standing there. Her face was painted with an expression that I couldn't quite read. She was looking directly at us, her eyes darting between me and her son, as if trying to piece together what had just happened. "Is everything okay in here?" she asked, her voice calm, but with an edge that I hadn't noticed before. For a moment, neither of us spoke. My stepson's face turned a shade paler, and I could feel the tension in my own chest tightening. My wife glanced at me, her eyes sharp. "What's going on?" I didn't know how to answer. I couldn't explain any of this to her, not yet. But there was something in the way she was looking at us, something I couldn't ignore. It was as if she already knew something was off. A subtle shift in her expression made me wonder, was she seeing things I wasn't? Did she sense that there was more to this situation than she realized? Or worse, had she figured it out already? Before I could find the words, my stepson stepped forward, a tightness in his voice that I hadn't heard before. We we were talking about something," he said quickly, his eyes flicking to me, then back to her. Just, just trying to figure it out." My wife nodded slowly, but I could tell she wasn't buying it. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment longer than usual, and I felt an unsettling chill run down my spine. "Well, you two can figure it out later," she said, her tone sharp. "But right now, dinner's ready." As she walked away, I realized something else. This wasn't just about us anymore. There was a bigger, darker layer to all of this that neither of us were ready to confront. And as the door clicked shut behind her, I could feel the walls closing in. After my wife left the room, I felt a sense of relief, if only for a moment. The heavy silence between me and my stepson seemed to stretch on forever, like we were both waiting for something to happen, but neither of us knew what that would be. He glanced at me, his face still tense, and for the first time, I could see just how much was weighing on him. He wasn't acting like a kid who had made a simple mistake anymore. He was different, more guarded, more unsure. I took a deep breath and stepped closer to him. "Look, we need to talk," I said, my voice quieter now, but firmer. "I don't know what's going on, but we can't leave it like this." He didn't answer right away, but I could see him wrestling with himself, trying to figure out how much to reveal. The tension was almost unbearable. But then, finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think I think I owe you an apology. Not for what happened earlier, but for what I've been keeping from you. It's not just the awkwardness, it's something else." My heart skipped a beat. What was he talking about? I wasn't prepared for whatever he was about to say, but I could tell it was important. "I don't know how to explain this," he continued, "but I think I've been acting strange because I've been feeling things I shouldn't. Not just about that moment, but about you." His words hung in the air, and the weight of them hit me like a wave. My mind raced, but I couldn't quite grasp what he was saying. Before I could respond, he quickly added, "I didn't mean it like that, I swear." I've just been confused about everything, about us, about my mom, about what I'm supposed to feel. I don't know what's normal anymore. My stomach twisted. The reality of the situation crashing down on me. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't just a moment of accidental embarrassment. This was something deeper, something neither of us had expected. Then, as if on cue, my wife stepped back into the room. Her face was different now, calmer, but there was a knowing look in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. She walked straight to us and, with a steady voice, said, "I think it's time you both knew the truth." Before either of us could react, she pulled a letter from her purse, one I hadn't noticed before. She handed it to me. It was addressed to me, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. As I unfolded it, my heart skipped a beat. It was from my stepson's biological father, the man who had disappeared from his life years ago. But the content? It was a confession, and the final line left me frozen in place. "I need to know if you can truly be the man he needs, because I'm not sure I can." Everything I thought I understood about the situation unraveled in that moment. I stood there, staring at the letter, my hands trembling. My stepson, who had been silent for so long, was now looking at me with a mix of confusion and vulnerability, like he was waiting for me to say something. The weight of everything, his admission, his father's words, the tension between us, felt like a knot in my chest that I couldn't untangle. My wife's calm presence was the only thing that grounded me. She stood beside me, her eyes soft but firm. "I wanted to tell you sooner, but it was never the right time," she said, her voice steady. "He's been struggling with this for a while, and I didn't know how to explain it to either of you." I glanced at my stepson again. He looked so much younger in that moment, vulnerable and uncertain. I had always thought of him as a boy with a tough exterior, someone who didn't let anything bother him. But now I realized how much he had been carrying on his shoulders, trying to figure out where he fit in a world that had never really given him a clear place. "I don't know what to say," I finally managed. "But I'm not going anywhere. Whatever you need, we can figure it out. We're family." The words felt heavy, but they were the truth. I could see the relief in his eyes, even though it was still buried beneath layers of doubt. My wife smiled, but it wasn't the smile I had expected. It was knowing, as though she had already seen this moment coming, as if she'd been waiting for me to be the one to bridge the gap between us all. Over the next few weeks, things didn't magically become perfect. There were still awkward moments, times when the tension would resurface. But something had shifted. The air felt lighter, as if we had acknowledged the unspoken weight between us and decided to carry it together. Slowly, we rebuilt the trust, piece by piece. And through it all, I realized something important. Being a family wasn't about perfection. It was about being there for each other when it counted the most. My stepson began to open up more, not just about that moment, but about his life, his fears, his dreams. And I realized that what mattered wasn't how everything started, but how we decided to move forward from here. There were still unresolved feelings, but they didn't feel so impossible anymore. The tension that had once felt unbearable began to feel like something we could work through together. As I sat with my family that night, the dinner table filled with laughter and small conversations, I understood one thing for sure. The most unexpected moments can sometimes lead to the most important changes. And this one, it had changed us all, hopefully for the better.